My experience with Conway Cat was less than positive. Though, unless you're the victim of a crime, I can't imagine any run-in with the law is positive. I had seen him around before, patrolling either on the street or in his car. I can't say that I ever saw him without that uniform though. I had friends whose kids made up rumors and stories about him. Cat was already a tall guy, so to them, he must have been gigantic. My neck hurts just thinking about it. It was late in the evening, and I had been out drinking. It was a bad day for me. My job was getting stressful. There was talk of layoffs and my friends couldn't find the time to join me. So I drank a little more than normal. Not the best idea, I know. But things felt like they were about to go to crap. So I just did what I wanted while I could. I didn't have the money for a taxi with everything I had spent. It got away from me. I sat in the car for a while, but I got pretty impatient and kind of anxious just sitting there in the night. Since no one else was on the pavement or the road, I decided to just go ahead and start driving. There wasn't anyone else really on the road at that time, so I guess that I felt free to drive. But he was there. I didn't encounter him until I had gone nearly a block. But by the time that I saw his car, his sirens were already on, and he was already following me. It was annoying, but I didn't really have a choice but to pull over. I'll give my best shot at describing what he looked like, but I'm no writer. Even though his last name was Cat, there was nothing feline about him. He was a towering hulk of a man, at least 6 foot, maybe even 7 if I had to guess. He wore a hat, but in his car's headlights, I could see the short brown hair on the sides of his head. His eyes were strange. They were hazel, but there was a dullness to them, like their color was slightly faded. It reminded me of old wallpaper. I was uncomfortable on my seat, like I was one of those kids looking up at him as he passed them without a word during the day. "Going a bit fast there, weren't you?" he said gently. I was about to say something in protest, to apologize or at least defend myself in whatever way would get through this quickly. But I just sat there, like my mind's vocal cords had shorted out, and just nodded. I'm a rebellious person, and I don't like being screwed over. I've got myself into arguments, even a few fights, and I'll go over a bill to make sure I'm not shortchanged by even a penny. But here, all of that rolled off my tongue. "Let's go, son." After he said that, he walked back to his car, not even looking back, like he just expected me to go with him. And I did. I followed him while his back was turned, and stepped into the back of the police car once he had opened the door for me. I stepped in, not even handcuffed. The drive to the police station was a blur. It was like my mind flickered on and off during the whole journey. I remember one thing clearly about that ride. I looked into the rearview mirror where I could see Cat's face as he drove, looking back at me. Our eyes met in that mirror for a moment, like a staring contest, but it didn't take long for me to look away. But he didn't stop looking at me. I started to sweat and felt a little dehydrated. The best way that I can describe it is like a desert. Like I was stranded and succumbing to heat stroke with no one there to help me. The only one that knew where I was the sun, beating down on me. Cat looked at me for a good while, but even though it was blurry, what I'm most sure about is that he was still driving. It gets blurry again after that, but a little later, he told me to get out of the car and follow him. I have never sleepwalked before, but it felt like I was sleepwalking while awake. My next clear memory is the slamming of the cell door. It was like a fog had cleared. I was on the floor when I felt normal again and looked up to see Cat standing just outside of the door, looking down at me from the window in the door, the only window in the room. His face was full of disgust, but his eyes remained the same. He called me disgusting and laughed. I pushed myself up before pain ran through my body. When I checked my arms and shirt, I realized that I was covered in bruises, but didn't remember when or where I got them. Worry was running through my mind as I sat there. Where was I? How long was he going to keep me here? I was interrupted from my thoughts when I heard a knocking on my wall. It came from the holding cell next to mine. I hadn't realized someone was next to me, nor did I know how long they had been there. They must have been in the neighboring cell before I got here. I made my way up to the wall before knocking back and got another knock in return. "Hello?" I called out, and then put my ear to the wall. Whoever it was said something, but I couldn't work out the words, and I assumed it was probably the same for them when I spoke. The hours went by, and we occasionally would knock on the walls, because even though we couldn't actually talk, it was a relief to know that I wasn't on my own, that someone else was there. I wasn't sure what time Cat came back. There wasn't a clock and my phone was gone. I was leaning against the wall when I heard footsteps in the hallway. I looked up to see him passing by my room. Soon after that, I heard a door swing open and hit the wall, making me jump. Even though sound could barely travel between the walls, I could hear his footsteps clearly after the door shut. The door was loud enough for me to hear even through the thick walls, but simple footsteps are another story. I shouldn't have been able to hear them at all, but they were somehow more audible than they had been in the hallway, like they were coming from the room I was in. Cat was making his way to the other side of the cell. He stopped when he reached the end of the room, and for a moment, things were silent. And then the screams came. You can call them scared, guttural, or harsh, but more than anything, they were pained. I can tell you now how clear those noises were. It was like the wall between us didn't even exist. The only positive thing I can say is that those screams barely lasted longer than the silence preceding them. but immediately after, there was a ripping sound. Something big had forcefully been torn, and then dropped to the floor like a piece of garbage. I heard a splash as if something had been tossed into a puddle. It went silent after that, but I kept listening. At first, I thought it was silent, but when I paid more attention and put my ear to the wall, there was a low sound coming from the other room. I didn't realize what it was at first, but when I did, I removed my ear, but the sound remained the same, along with a terrible stench. After a few minutes, the neighboring cell's door opened again. Only this time, it was more gentle, and I didn't hear him walk. A moment after the door slammed shut, I saw him standing outside my cell. When he turned to look at me, I flinched. I felt like I was burning up like before, but this time was far worse. I could feel the sweat building up between my fingers and toes, while my skin almost looked sunburnt. My heart was pumping before, but it went even faster now, and I started to wonder if I would succumb to heat stroke or a heart attack first. My throat and mouth went dry, and I started to cough, bringing me forward enough to keep over. I stared up at him. His eyes were still on me. I tried to beg for it to stop, but I couldn't stop coughing long enough to get a word out. The heat only got worse. If I stopped coughing, I might have started screaming instead. But I was proved wrong when I couldn't cough anymore, and I started to suffocate. I cried knowing he was still watching me squirm on that concrete floor. I must have passed out, because I woke up on that floor. Everything was silent, and I couldn't smell anything, so I got as comfortable as I could on the bench again. Cat was gone. The burns I couldn't feel anymore, but the bruises ached. I knocked on the wall but got no answer. I didn't know how much time had passed as I waited there. The waiting was the worst part, not knowing whether or not he was going to come back, and sat in the corner. Things felt better near those two walls, more stable. It was daytime when I was let out, not by Cat, but someone else. He led me out and sent me on my way. When we walked by the cells, I looked into my neighboring room. It was completely empty. When I asked the policeman about it, he looked confused and told me that there wasn't any record of anyone there over the last 24 hours. Something told me that I should drop it, even though it bothered me. More than anything, I wanted to get out of there. I haven't had any run-ins with the police, especially Cat, since then. Whether shifts had gotten switched around, or I just didn't spend as long outside that pub, I didn't know. But as long as I didn't see him again, it didn't matter. Sometimes I did see him in the distance though, recognizing that huge frame and police uniform. His back was always turned, which meant that I could go the other way without being seen. But still, sometimes I feel like he can see me even when his back is turned. When I'm inside, Sometimes I start to sweat, or my heart beats a little too fast, and I think that he's there. A few days after the encounter, someone knocked on my door. When I answered it, there was no one there. The only indication that there was anyone there was a terrible stench